Hello, everybody. Welcome to our talk today. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen to what we have to say about open source development. Our talk today is called Open Source Adulthood, What We Learned Growing Up. I am Kendall Nelson. I work for the OpenStack Foundation, and I've been actually actively involved in the OpenStack community since 2015. So before I started at the foundation, I was involved. I have been in a variety of roles from everything from technical committee vice chair to the release management team. I'm heavily involved in contributor onboarding. So I work a lot on the contributor guide and the in-person training we have called Upstream Institute. I have also done a lot of work with the Women of OpenStack, which is now our diversity and inclusion working group. But other than OpenStack, I've also been involved in the Kubernetes community since 2019, in SIG Cloud Provider, specifically provider OpenStack, and SIG Contributor Experience. When I'm not working on open source, I really love to travel, which unfortunately we're not getting to do right now a whole lot. But that just gives me more time to go out and explore and take photos and watch more Harry Potter and Doctor Who. And let my co-speaker introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Jean-Philippe Evrard. You might remember me from open source software communities that are not Kubernetes because I'm new in here. As Jean-Philippe might be hard to pronounce for the non-French speakers, you can call me JP. I'm working for SUSE, and I've been involved in multiple open source projects like OpenStack, where I'm a member of the technical committee and reviewer in a few projects. What defines me is that I love to learn new things. If you are looking for conversation starters with me, I put you a list of topics through emojis down there on the slide. You can even combine them together. A good example of an icebreaker would be, why do you call these French fries, though they are obviously better in Belgium? Another good example is, why does that beer emoji look so disgusting with the foam outside and not inside the glass?
So today we're going to talk about the stages of life, not just for a person, but also through a person in an open source community and the open source project itself. We'll go through the kind of life events, explain them on those different scales and all the similarities between them. So we'll walk through all of that while we also walk through this graph, which I hope you are familiar with. So this is the Gartner hype cycle. Generally, it tells the typical life of a software project, everything from the very beginning with R&D and early adopters, growing rapidly in visibility up to the peak of inflated expectations where mass media has picked up and helped with the hype cycle. And then you move through to maybe some negative press, supplier failures, that sort of thing, and then on towards the plateau of productivity, which hopefully in most people's lives would be like retirement. But without further ado, we'll get started. JP?
Yeah, so what's interesting in graphs is that without a clearly defined axis and scale, it can mean everything and nothing. For example, in this case, we'll change the Y, the vertical axis, visibility, with perceived fun factor axis. I think the resulting graph can match events in personal life or events in project life. And your first stages in life are the childhood and adolescence phases. I hope you can relate to this graph. When people are younger, they're supposed to be in an always increasing curve of fun, slowly starting, then growing fast, and then slowing down. At least the curve applied to me. When I was a kid, I had tons of fun. Let's talk about this. So this was my class when I was a kid. Most of my friends were white boys. Yes, that's what this emoji is. Because that's sadly the monocultural environment I was raised in. When I was a kid, my whole life was about school, eating stuff, sports, playing games with my friends. I was playing board games with a certain group of friends, computer games with another, and well, you get the gist. And basically, I learned to play games with friends, and mostly in small groups. I considered that I was a lucky kid because there was very little I had to worry about. When I grew up, the fun factor started to slow down because I had tests and exams, but it was still mostly fun. Even during those test periods, I was still playing games and having fun. I fondly remember when a friend lent me his Nintendo during my exams. My parents hated it though, but that's another topic. And guess what? It's often the same for an open source project. You're in a new class of software. You do something different than the other class of software before you. It regroups people that are very similar with identical problems. And that's the start. That's the monoculture you start with. You're having some fun with the people which contribute to the project like you. This is your small group of friends having the same needs, with which you have fun and you learn. Again, it's in small groups, and there is a strong outsider effect in there. There is probably terrible dogs as people learn from each other. At the beginning of your project, you don't care about many things except getting your code to work. So you don't worry too much about your project community building because you might think the community will grow automatically with the workability of your code. At least you feel good because you see new people joining the small group. Keep in mind that the project has its tests too. The project sometimes have hiccups. It's not always fun to set up what you don't really want to set up, like CI/CD, for example. If you're not a CI/CD person, would have to work on things that are broken if you want to focus on hacking on some new code. Imagine yourself as a new contributor of a project. At first, you only want to get your first contributions in. It's fun, you're learning from the other people having the same problems. You might get lucky and have someone mentoring you, or maybe you ask one-on-one questions with someone on a communication channel. The next stage is to start to help others, and learn some more by participating in projects live. But yes, it can get a little less fun. It's a little less fun when the tests are not passing, for example. You now have to care about the test. You have to figure out and fix it. But at the end, you're even happier because you achieved to merge something and you help the community at the same time.
So, to kind of summarize like childhood, the things that we're generally focused on as kids and as like new contributors to a community and as a new community are first and foremost fun. Like fun is what drives everything, the excitement and in turn the visibility. And the other side of that is growth. You want to grow as a community and grow as a project and grow as a person and work towards like later adolescence and early adulthood into being an actual adult. But the problems with this that you run into down the road are that you're not being as focused on things like documentation or onboarding or cementing processes as you could be. And so you often have to recalibrate further down the road. You're not preparing for the future because you're more focused on fun and growing up. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what you're going to have to account for. So what we learned during childhood is that you don't want to think so much about the future that you inhibit growth, but you also don't want to grow recklessly and have to pick up the pieces later on. Fun is important and a big part of any project, but it's not the be-all, end-all of the future. So moving into adulthood now. Adulthood as like a stage of life. I'd like to think I'm an adult most days. Definitely not as fun as it was as a kid. You have a lot more responsibilities now. I like help take care of a house and I have to pay rent or help with the mortgage. I, have to work, have all of those responsibilities. I'm focused on going about life day to day, continuing to grow as much as I can, but having to do all of that and kind of retemper expectations about where I want to go in life and readjust goals. This is all things that you think about when you're a contributor in a project too. It can often feel overwhelming because there's so much work to be done. I know I have a to-do list in OpenStack a mile long and another one in Kubernetes a mile long. But making friends in the community is what makes it all worth it. All the overwhelming stress of everything. Building and maintaining those long-term connections with other contributors is my favorite part of my job. They're my friends in my support network. I will do whatever I can to help them get jobs, and if I needed a job, I would like to think they would do the same for me. So you work on growth and community roles. Figuring out what those goals are might also be difficult. There's so many different roles in every community, and they're all defined differently and subtly different. So like in OpenStack, you have a core reviewer and a PTL and TC and all of this alphabet soup. And there are similar roles in the Kubernetes community with like maintainers and like SIG chair and stuff like that. And figuring out which roles you want to work towards can also be hard if your focus is on non-traditional contributions. It's not just code and docs all the time. Maybe you want to help with the SIG contributor experience, for example. And once you achieve these goals, you realize there's even more responsibility. You go from working towards buying the house, and then now you have to maintain the house. So you work towards achieving this role in the community, and then now there are even more meetings, and there's more things you want to do, and there's no end to what is the next step. As a like open source project, there are events that happen all the time. They might be focused just on your project. They might also be hosted by a different community, and you want to participate and help bridge the two communities. Your focus becomes on simplification, because during childhood, it was build all the things, go all the directions at once, explore all the opportunities. And now you kind of have to rein that back in, and you kind of become the enemy of your own popularity, where people are trying to do things that were not within the original scope, and you have to rein that back in. So there's a little bit more resource delegation and strategizing that you have to do, especially if your project came about at the same time as one or two others that really weren't that different. You have to distinguish yourself from them, and why are you the solution, or maybe they're a solution to a slightly different problem. And what do you do with like all these contributions? You're drowning in patches from people and pull requests, and they're like more things than you know what to do with. And then you also maybe at the same time are drowning in people, but some of the original contributors are starting to move on, and you have to adjust to that as well. Well, one of those things that an open source project should start to do is invest in the community. Working on communication and documentation, kind of cleaning up the onboarding process. There are probably a lot of barriers, or it's not clearly written down anywhere, so the documentation is important. Documentation is always the most important thing. It does not get enough time. And then the last thing that you do as an adult open source project is maybe kind of clarify the mission a little bit more and redefine it if you need to help separate yourself from those other projects and kind of rein in on the sprawl that happened during childhood and the rapid growth. Next stage.
So during early adulthood of the project, we wanted to continue growing the amount of people, grow diversity, readjust goals, readjust the barrier of entry, like improve docs and mentoring. But there were problems. Not everyone had the same expectations. The new goals don't fit everyone. People have frustrations, and it's more work than you expected. So what we learned during adolescence and early adulthood is that it's hard to support everyone in one-to-one fashion like it was in childhood. So we had to deal with onboarding differently. We understood the need to simplify, delegate, and strategize. we need to do something for the project, and because we can't continue losing people, we can't continue having detractors. So after early adulthood, you might enter the next phase, the midlife crisis. We could argue that some projects don't go through that crisis, but some individuals and projects do. So let's talk about it. So after the adulthood, you enter a phase where you have more uncertainties. You doubt about achievements in life and about its goals. You want to take drastic changes in your lifestyle and feel the wish to change past decisions or events. You might be asking yourself, why do I have to deal with all of that? Adulthood is too tedious, too annoying. Why can't I take a little bit more fun where I can? How can I fight the inevitability of life? And there comes the midlife crisis. You can now cue a Faith No More song in your brand new sports car. But then you realize in just a moment, and you acquire more wisdom. You have planned for continued growth after recalibrating your expectations. So yes, the parallel applies to open source projects again. The project will go through uncertainties as there are still detractors. They will still be there. There are still many problem talkers and not enough problem solvers. You will reach a phase where you heard people wanting to change decisions or events. For OpenStack, an example was the big tent was not a good idea. Was it a good choice? Well, now you question yourself a little more. Some of those conversations and questions lead to extra courses changes. By realizing as a community that there are many processes that can and should be simplified. Those processes that you might have highlighted in early adulthood phase. In OpenStack, for example, we learned a lot about new decisions and we discussed a lot, about new decisions and previous events. Again, the big tent. I should probably explain what the big tent is. The TLDR of it is that the big tent exploded the list of OpenStack projects, allowing them to be official OpenStack projects. At the end, which is something I guess we could talk more during the next stage of the maturity cycle, the big tent helped grow the amount of software, increase the diversity, increase the coverage of OpenStack user needs, making OpenStack more mature and more malleable. Even though there are some projects in the big tent that have now rightfully died since the time of the big tent, the clear scope of the big tent was a good thing, in my opinion. Anyway, enough talking about OpenStack. It's possible at the time that midlife crisis happens, that people leave the community for new shinies. But yes, people also join your project, and the crisis of the downfall of contributions stop. We learn to deal with the contributors we have. We have some kind of constant, some kind of stability. And so we focused on onboarding and work with a reduced group of people, invest in them, have fun with them, enjoy the work together. And that happened because of the ever readjusting course focus. Before we talk about the next step in cycle of life, I wanted to share my experience as a long-term contributor of a project, for which uncertainties also happen. At some point, if you're a long-time contributor to a project, you might be getting worried about what you're doing, where you're heading. You might be concerned that software defines you forever, have a label on you. You have uncertainty about the next step and might want to change the course of your career, like starting to raise sheep in the mountains instead of doing software development. I think it's fair to say it's normal to think about career movement, and it's normal to test or not new shiny software. and you have to make peace with you or other people doing it. It's normal that your friends from the same project might feel the same. And what I find nice myself is that during the time I worked on a project, I've established some nice relationships that I wish to keep. Maybe they won't be on the same next open source project as I do, but maybe it's going to be the one after that. And in fact, that's the part I like, I live with. That's my constant during uncertainties, the relationships I've built in the open source communities.
So to kind of summarize midlife crises, they're hard, but they're not the end. They're just as much about growth as childhood is. It's just more of a recalibration and a reset than starting from scratch. It's that recalibration that you do that sets you up for the rest of your life and eventually retirement, where you've made peace with where you are and the path that you're on, but you're still growing and making progress and moving forward. So moving on to the rest of adulthood, and hopefully someday retirement. I know I would like to retire someday. What I understand of retirement, not being there yet, is that there's a lot less pressure to grow and evolve, and that makes your life generally more relaxed. It's also stable at this point. There's not a whole lot of growth or like backward steps, which could mean a lot of different things depending on where you are specifically in your life. But I imagine you like have your budgets pretty solidified by then and you're paying bills, or maybe you're completely done paying off loans and 100% debt free. I'm getting there, but obviously there's always going to be more debt to acquire too. But everything is self-driven. You are motivated by your own wants and what you want to do more than working for this employer or being driven by this loan or whatever. Everything is more focused on you and what you want to do. So what that looks like as a contributor to like a stable open source project is that you spend a lot of time bridging with other communities and working together. So you're making these new connections. I have spent a good amount of time over the last 2 years working on Kubernetes, bridging that community with the OpenStack community, because there's a lot of good that can be done together if we, are a little bit more mindful about what's going on in this community and that community. So new friends. There's you never stop making friends in open source, that's for sure. You see a lot of the same people and there's a lot of the same connections, but there are always new people that are joining this project or that project that you get to meet and connect with. And then old friends, they obviously stick around too. Like I said, the same people keep coming back around. And they're understanding if you leave a community, because hopefully you're, really good friends with that person, and it doesn't matter how long it's been since you've seen them. You might run into them at another conference and enjoy getting coffee with them. And then like the last facet of this is retirement for an open source project doesn't actually mean like retired. It can still be around and used, but there is going to be like the outreach that I was talking about, going to other communities and events and doing talks and bridging the communities together so that we can solve more problems and grow more and continue to evolve. But the focus is clear. There's a lot more clarity now than there ever was before, and things are kind of settled and stable for the foreseeable future, potentially forever. But realizing that one project can't solve all the problems gives you a much better focus on like your goal as a project and your direction. And since one project can't solve all the problems, we need to work together. And since we're working together and we have all of this clarity and focus, things are a lot more stable than they were. You might be in maintenance mode and not taking on a bunch of new features and stuff, and that's totally fine. You might be, focused on lowering technical debt still and simplification, and that's That's good. That's a different sort of stability. And maybe you're just keeping requirements up to date, different sort of stability. So let JP kind of give us some final words here.
Yeah, so a quick recap would be that first, the fun factor is not a constant over time, and it's normal. So projects should try to calibrate fun and moments with less fun, and make things fun where you can. Second part was that any investment in lowering tech debt, simplifying processes, have easy onboarding, and early contributions are good. Anything you can take there, take it. And the last bit is that having a clear focus helps. Don't hesitate to adapt your focus based on the world's needs. Adapt with other projects, communicate with other projects. It's not only you and your friends like you. It's for you, your friends, and your future new friends. And that's why we are a community. Thank you.